Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm glad that you are interested in butterflies. And actually, I mean, who wouldn't be interested in butterflies? They just can add an incredible dimension to our desert landscapes. Seasonally, we have different species. So I just wanted to remind you, you have a handout that has a lot of text. And the first few pages, I'm going to kind of briefly run through the major aspects of that information. And you can refer to that later if you want some little bit more in depth. You have, following all that main text, you have a list of plants. That's what we'll be following through once I go through the basics. If you'd like to make notes there, indicate which plants you like or whatever. And I've given you the botanical name as well as a common name or maybe more than one if they're available. And it's important when you're plant shopping to have that botanical name written down so that you can kind of check labels at the nursery to make sure that you're getting the plant that you're interested in. The world of common names can cause quite a bit of confusion with one plant having multiple common names, and I call it one thing, the person at the nursery calls it another, and when I ask where to find it, they're like, oh, we don't have any of those, when they might have a whole block of them for you to choose from. The other challenge is that sometimes we have more than one plant that might go by a particular common name. And that can really throw you off. You might think when it's in the nursery, well, this doesn't look right, but it says it's such and such. Maybe it'll look right when it grows some. You're more insured to get the plant you're interested in if you have those scientific or botanical names dotted down to take with you to the nursery. The last page of your handout has some references. I think a nice selection of books that you might be interested in and some websites. So we've got a lot to cover and I'm just going to dive right in. All right, so our butterflies, we have so many species that are found here in Arizona. We're very fortunate also in that we can have butterfly activity pretty much year-round. Now, butterflies are ectotherms. They have to have warm temperatures, nice sun for them to be able to, flutter around. They can't control their body temperature. So that could be one limiting factor. But overall, we do have, even in the winter, some species of butterflies that we can be accommodating in our garden spaces. And there are butterflies that range from very flamboyant in color to maybe a little bit more muted, some that are just cool, funky, such as the group of snout-nose butterflies. They have this protrusion there, which I think is fascinating. And they're colorful also. And the important thing is to recognize if you truly want to have a butterfly garden, you need to be aware of the life cycle of your butterflies that you're attracting that could be found in your area. And probably the most important, if you are going to be a serious butterfly gardener, you need to accept the fact that for them to complete their life cycle, some plant matter has to disappear, as in you will be feeding the larvae or caterpillars of those butterflies to allow them to complete their life cycle. So we have adults, which are very visible, very noticeable. They are primarily, spend their adult portion of their life cycle seeking a mate. Some of them might not feed much at all, and others feed on nectar. and other forms of food, but primarily for our desert gardening, attracting butterflies. We're going to talk about nectar sources. The female, once she has mated, will lay eggs, which are generally very, very, very tiny. From the egg will hatch a caterpillar, a larva, and they are teensy tiny. When they emerge from that teeny little egg, they will eat and grow until they are ready to pupate and form their chrysalis. Sometimes the chrysalis is very interesting looking, very colorful, such as we find with the queen and monarch butterflies. Other times they might be looking like dried up, crumpled leaves. So we need to be aware of their life cycle. And they have that what we call complete metamorphosis. You think back to high school biology class, you remember that. Oops. So let me make sure. Okay. So when we are looking, is there a bar covering the top of the slides? There it goes. Okay. What we need to remember for our larvae or the young caterpillars is the food source is pretty much specific, or a specific type of plant is needed, or a specific group of related plants. So once an egg hatches and your larva emerges, our insects have what we refer to as exoskeletons. They don't have an internal bone skeleton such as we do and other mammals do. Their form comes from the exoskeleton, which is basically almost like an exterior skin. Well, that won't stretch enough for them to get from newly emerged from the egg to the size of which they would pupate. So they have to shed that exoskeleton. They might do it a few times. It's dependent upon the exact species of the butterfly. And we call these cycles of shedding the exoskeleton the molts. So molting, they're shedding that exoskeleton, and a new one is already formed in their tissues. It just needs to harden. So they will eat and molt, eat and molt, eat and molt a few times until they're sufficiently matured in the larval stage to form their chrysalis. So we have teeny tiny little, oh, good grief. Did I do that? We have teeny tiny little instars that emerge from the egg, and this is a tiny queen, and they eventually get larger and larger. We can see here the black swallowtail shedding its exoskeleton. So, it just eats, they're eating machines basically. And we see one here. This one is just molted. It has crawled out of the skin that we can see that's left here. And when they're very small, you might not notice them. You might notice their frass, their caterpillar poop on plants. But eventually you'll notice the munching because the larger they get, the more they eat. Once they have sufficiently matured in that larval stage, then it's time to pupate. This is a monarch, and generally we refer to preparing to pupate. The caterpillars will be in J configuration, and they will attach with some little silk-like material to a surface. Sometimes they will pupate on the plants that they've been feeding on. Other times they might crawl away to something, the side of a building or a chair or something like that. So they don't always stay with the plant that they've utilized for developing. The monarch we see here, it just started the process on the 9th of November in the morning. And through the next few days or next day, we see about 24 hours later, it's wiggled out. It's completed its final molt out of this exoskeleton, and it's taking that form that we think of for the chrysalis. You can see it's getting a little bit larger here, and we're starting to see more of that wing form that will eventually develop through the pupation. And so 10th of November, you can see more enlargement of that. So we have with the monarch a beautiful green chrysalis with gold dots. And here a month later, or about a month, a little over a month later, that adult is ready to emerge. It is totally changed in form to what we recognize as the adult. You can even see the casing here becomes translucent. You can even see the colors of the monarch as it's getting ready to emerge. And voila, here it's hanging on to that chrysalis skeleton, and they need a while for those wings to unfurl, and they're pumping fluids through the veins of their wings so that they get to the correct shape. And that's a very vulnerable time for them. Predators can easily grab them because they can't fly at this state. So, but eventually those wings will puff out and they'll be ready to fly away. So this is just an example of another chrysalis that butterfly has emerged from. And then here we have those wings fully developed, fully stretched and pumped with the fluids so it can fly away now. Now, from the adult stage, remember, we have the eggs. These adults have to mate. These are some blues. They're very, very tiny. They have to mate, lay the eggs, and the female, she knows what plant she has to find to lay her eggs on, because as soon as those eggs hatch, those young caterpillars need the proper food to start eating right away. Some of the caterpillars might eat the egg casing, others don't. They just walk away, crawl away, I guess. So we need sunny spaces, open sunny spaces for these butterflies to make sure that they have sufficient warmth. And we also need, if it's too shady on cooler days, they won't be able to be active. So just keep that in mind to have some sunny open spaces as well. They are so light, they weigh practically nothing. So we have to make sure that if your property has a lot of wind traveling through it, maybe create a windbreak. Plant some larger shrubs that can slow the movement of that wind through your property. That way it will be easier for the butterflies to come in and float around and find their food resources in your landscape. Now, unlike hummingbirds that hover to feed, butterflies typically have to land. They often use what we call a landing pad, sometimes it's referred to. So it just means a surface that is large enough that their feet can grab onto, and then they can extend their proboscis and sip the nectar from the flowers. So if you see the configurations here, we have this landing pad and numerous individual little flowers of this cluster. They can land and feed off of several flowers at a time. Same with this floral configuration. With our composites or daisy or sunflower relatives, they are actually numerous individual flowers in this head. So again, perfect landing pad, and the butterflies can sip from each individual flower as they're perched there. Another landing pad, several flowers to feed from here again. And with our puffball configuration that we find on many of our trees, our leguminous trees, the mesquite and some acacias and things also offer that suitable perch for them to feed. There are some tubular flowers. Now, it depends on the butterfly, and it depends on the tubular flower. Some are just too long that the butterflies can't get to the nectar. So they bypass those. Those are more specific to the hummingbirds. But with this one, some of these tubular flowers have a lip that might be downturned. They can perch there. And if they're proboscis, that extended straw is sufficiently long, they can tap into that nectar. But overall, they like small flowers in clusters or small tubular flowers. This is rosemary, little blue visiting that rosemary. Another cluster on this ground cover, several flowers here. I think skippers are so cute. They're small. I think probably a lot of people think they're just too drab, but I absolutely adore them. They just look so fuzzy and cuddly. Just want to hug them or rub their little furry cheeks. And they are very active here, different species in the valley. You want to be able to plant, make sure that you plant enough to really attract the butterflies. It's nice to have a variety, but the main thing is to have sufficient bloom to draw them in. And once they hit your garden, then they'll see how wonderful it is, what a paradise you have. And they'll spend time, the adults, visiting the nectar sources. And if you have appropriate larval food plants, then they will lay eggs. So here's just a wonderful spring garden. There's several different types of perennials and shrubs in this garden. Peak blooms in the spring, but there are also plants within this landscape that offer nectar basically at every time of the year. And that is the best arrangement of plants for your garden. Butterflies don't drink water like we had bird baths, and that's not the most suitable for them. They have a need for minerals as much as the moisture, and butterflies will be active in puddling. So if you have a wet spot, which could be a little dish, shallow dish, such as this one, in that cute little heart-shaped dish, it's filled with sand and has a little grid here. You can put some water in it to keep that sand moist. And especially the males need these minerals to able to why is it the only thing I can think of is pollinate, fertilize the female's eggs. So it's very important. This is just some moist soil, as we have here. This is in a nice heavily mulched landscape, and some irrigation had been running, so there's sufficient moisture left. And this was just an open spot after some water had been applied. A little bit muddy, you can see some of these footprints, but it's ideal for perhaps your butterflies. Butterflies need shelter. They need to be protected from predators and the elements. They also need places to roost overnight or during bad weather. So some of them have perhaps favorites, and others might just look around for something sufficiently dense and accessible, but giving them maybe some low visibility from predators. Now, the young, as I mentioned, they will eat plant material. Most often, the plants are fine. If you have healthy plants, they very quickly will rebound with developing new foliage. And it's not frequently that they will actually kill a plant. That wouldn't make sense for them for survival of the species of insect, the butterfly. So they want to leave a little something for the plants to recover and produce more food for themselves or future generations. So some of our caterpillars might eat foliage. They're eating these leaves here on this pipe vine. The monarch eating leaves on a milkweed. Monarchs might also eat young, tender, green developing milkweed pods before they get dry and too fibrous. When it's too fibrous, you know, that stuff gets stuck between their little caterpillar teeth, hard to floss. Okay, now, so when it's time, when a caterpillar is eaten sufficiently, it will be ready to pupate. And as I mentioned, sometimes the monarch and queen butterflies need milkweeds to complete their life cycle. And sometimes they might pupate right on the plant or crawl away to some sometimes far off location. So make sure you've got nectar available year-round for the adults through a variety of plants is always the best for good nutrition, and keep these butterflies safe. Even if you're using organic pesticides that can, a lot of these, depending on how they're used or when they're used, can actually harm butterflies. And a favorite product to use for caterpillars, the bad ones, such as looper caterpillars or maybe tomato hornworms, is a product, it's a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis. Well, that will just as easily kill the caterpillars of desired butterflies. So always be very, very cautious in using any kind of a pesticide. It's better to just let nature take care of bad insect species or populations. We can depend on beneficial insects such as these wonderful lady beetles or other insects that are definitely around and about in the valley. Now I am going to speed through a whole bunch of plants. It was impossible for me to pare down the list. So I'm going to attempt to get through as many of these as we can this evening. But if I do run out of time, you have your handout, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any of them, but you do have a list of resources that you can get information about them if you're interested in having those plants in your garden. I'm going to start with the nectar plants. Some plants offer nectar to the adults. They're an adult food source. Some plants only provide food for the developing caterpillars, the larvae, the young. There are some plants that accommodate both adult and young. But I'm going to start with our nectar plants, and we will look at some larger forms, some large shrubs and trees. Now this bee brush is fabulous because it has a super long bloom period that ranges from typically early spring to late fall. It is graced with these tiny, delicate looking white flowers. They're very sweet smelling, by the way, and these are great for a good variety of different butterflies. Here we see a blue, a queen, a painted lady. You'll get all kinds of different species of butterflies visiting to sip the nectar, as well as hummingbirds and pollinator bees. Duranta erecta, skyflower. This is a large shrub that has a bloom period primarily through the warm season, as with the bee brush. The flowers develop in kind of sprays, these elongated clusters. This is an evergreen shrub that has almost tropical looking foliage, so it's great. You can use it to have more of an oasis effect even, but it is quite drought tolerant. My favorite, is the sweet memory. The flowers have a deep purple color with a frilly white margin. However, the most common available is one that has this kind of muted bluish purple color. I believe that's where its common name skyflower comes from. And there's also available white blooming forms. You can get some that have variegated foliage that are kind of a cream color and green. After pollination of the flowers, you might have fruits develop. They are kind of pea size, ripen to a golden orange color. They are toxic to humans, but these are great for our native fruit-eating birds. And hummingbirds visit the flowers. So here's one of my favorite skippers. Look at that. That proboscis just slurping up the nectar here. This is a nice kind of large-scale shrub also that you might consider using as a windbreak or a screen in your garden. Kidneywood is a wonderful tree that is fairly small. It might only get to be about, 10 foot or 12 foot in height. Some might get even up to 15 feet in height. They are a little open in their growth habit, not super dense. They have that delicate foliage similar to a mesquite. These flower clusters are covering these trees in the spring. They have a light sweet scent. The butterflies will visit these, and usually through the summer, especially with a little rain, you'll have some more bloom to offer those flowers for the butterflies. And I will mention that the kidneywood usually drops its leaves during the winter around here. Our desert lavender has just fabulous foliage that if you gently caress it, it smells like lavender. These have various growth forms, but they're usually kind of open and airy. Some might get about 6 foot tall and wide. Others might get 8 or 10 feet tall. So there's a little bit of variability. You might do some light pruning to kind of send it in another direction if it's not pleasing your exact specifications, but of course the butterflies will come to any of them. Heavy bloom in the spring with tiny, tiny little purple flowers that are just perfect for the butterflies. They're born in clusters. You can see here at the node points where the leaves develop, you'll have clusters of these tiny flowers, heavy bloom in the spring and the fall, and anytime during the summer months, especially if we get a little rain, you'll have a little bit more bloom. So they're absolutely wonderful. Remember, something like this, it can potentially get fairly tall. So that's going to be a plant that's going to be farther in towards even perhaps the back of a garden bed. Now, here's another one that gets pretty large. The thornberry. There are a few different species native to our region. This particular one and its closest relative, the Lycium fremontii, usually have 2 or 3 bloom cycles through the year. The flowers are small, usually kind of a muted rosy lavender color. The butterflies, different species will visit this. Once they're pollinated, you'll have fruit for the fruit-eating birds and for yourself also. The mesquites are wonderful for butterflies. That configuration of the flower, several tiny little flowers in a grouping, elongated cluster here. So we have our main spring bloom, of course, with all the mesquites. And so they can be providing quite a bit of nectar to butterflies. So our screwbee mesquite, it's among the smallest of the mesquites. And I just love these cool, funky seed pods that they develop. Wahoo. This is a heavy, heavy, heavy spring bloomer. You might even have more bloom during the summer with a little bit of rain. And all of these rounded puffballs are heavily, sweetly scented. The flowers attract a range of butterflies. Here we've got some painted ladies, but they'll attract several other types of butterflies as well. And most often you'll get a little bit more bloom later in the summer. Not as heavy as the initial spring bloom, but still a nice source of nectar later in the summer season. the vitex or chase tree, monk's pepper tree. See, I told you some of these plants have numerous identities. They are heavy spring bloomers with some successive lesser bloom through the summer months. The flowers are sweetly scented. They are tiny, born in these real elongated clusters. Most common is probably this lavender color, but there are also pink ones and white blooming forms available. Make sure if you want a particular color, make sure that you purchase it in bloom, or some nurseries will even mark them. If they bloom, they'll mark them. So even if you don't purchase it when it's in a bloom cycle, you would still know what color. And its monk's pepper tree comes from the seeds that it develops. So you'll get different kinds of butterflies, and definitely the hair streaks are attracted to your vitex. These are magnificent butterflies. Now, a lot of times, these creatures will try to fool predators by having bright colors or patterns that might appear as eyes, big eyes, to scare off a predator or make them look like they're larger than they are. And the hair streak has these eye spots there on its hind wing, and it also has these little protrusions. And it's very interesting because as they're perched and they're feeding, those hind wings, they move back and forth. And I guess, maybe that gives more scariness to them. They've got these little fringed devices here and these antennae looking things and the eyes. So I guess that really helps scare off potential predators. Now some shrubs getting a little bit lower. This flame acanthus has a long bloom from late spring around May, usually until even November, with these tubular flowers. They are tubular, but there are some species of butterflies that have sufficiently long proboscis, and the petals, they're splayed out in 4 directions. So it does give them an opportunity, ease to perch there. They can cling on to those petals to perch and feed. The woolly butterfly bush, infinitely better than those non-native, maybe more colorful butterfly bushes that need a lot of water. They don't want too much sun in the summer. They're pretty needy. But this from the Chihuahuan Desert is super drought tolerant and a stupendous bloom in the spring that will gradually taper through the summer, but you'll get months of bloom. The flowers are in a kind of a globose configuration of tiny, bright orange colored flowers. So they've got their landing pad, they can perch and sip nectar from all these different individual flowers. And it doesn't really travel through the air, but these are really sweetly scented. So if you kind of are in range, you can, direct your nose to one of those flower clusters and take a whiff to enjoy the sweetness. Of course, the Baja or red fairy duster, they have a heavy bloom in the spring and the fall. In between, I'd say any day of the year, you'll have at least a few clusters of bloom. As long as you've got it in a nice sunny location, they can just keep blooming year round. So what looks like a big flower, fluffy, is actually a grouping of individual flowers. And all that flamboyance comes from the male reproductive system of the flower, the stamens. So they'll lure in different types of butterflies to sip that nectar in that little floral cup. So here we have some of our swallowtails visiting, and you'll have different types. We also have our native pink fairy duster that is smaller in stature. The pink fairy duster mainly has a spring bloom. If our monsoon season is decent, you'll have more kind of late summer early fall bloom. If it's a dry summer, you probably just had your spring bloom. That's the only unfortunate thing, because this little pink fairy dusters just has lovely, lovely, very delicate pink coloring. It can range. Some are very, very pale pink. Others are deep pink, almost a red. This generally gets only to be about 3 to 4 foot tall. And, you know, what a shame. Do not do this to your butterflies or hummingbirds. This stays small, so there's no reason to shear it. At least they did leave the top for bloom to develop, but they sheared the sides. It's kind of this inverted cone shape, or no, I guess upright cone shape. The loss of bloom here, it makes me cry. So keep that in mind as you're maintaining, you're caring for your plants. Don't go crazy shearing your shrubs. Let them grow into a natural form. If you have chosen the right plant for the right place, it will be the perfect size, and you won't need to be pruning, except for maybe just annually a light cleanup. There are different species of dahlias, shrubby dahlias. This is the smallest, the black dahlia. This is a fall bloomer, September, October, November. All of them have a slightly different bloom cycle, but generally somewhere between fall and spring, your dahlias will be blooming, the shrubby ones. And these clusters of kind of pea-like flowers, these are bicolored, this rosy purple and white. They definitely will attract a range of different butterflies, such as these maroon blues here. Oh, fall bloom with the turpentine bush. The foliage, I think, is very fresh smelling, but somebody's nose interpreted it differently and gave it that horrible name. So most of these plants I'm talking about prefer sun, but this turpentine bush has to be in full sun to get this brilliant of a bloom in the fall. If it's, say, under a mesquite tree, your turpentine bush will lay down and protest and probably won't give you any bloom. So sun, sun, sun. September, October, November, these brilliant golden yellow flower clusters will lure several different types of butterflies into your garden. We have the queen here visiting to sip the nectar. Nice small size, usually about 3 foot by 3 foot at maturity. Even lower, between 1 and 2 feet in height, is the native flat top buckwheat. It's another one that just loves the sun, very drought tolerant. We usually have a dynamite bloom in the spring, and then again in the fall with our native buckwheat. They can range from a pinkish color, if it's got those pink veins in the flowers, or might be even a little bit more white looking. But tight clusters of several very small flowers can attract some different butterflies here, such as this Texan crescent.
Hey, Kirti.
Yes.
I got a quick comment from someone that says, I've had hawk moths eat entire pepper plants and tomato plants. I don't know if you know anything about that, but it was just a comment that one of the attendees had made.
Okay. Those tomato and tobacco hornworms, sometimes they can go a little overboard. That's probably the most common situation that you'd have with those caterpillars. But overall, most of them, they're not going to feed too much. If you've seen the adult, well, not adult caterpillars, but the mature caterpillars of those moths, they can get huge. And so they do eat a lot. I'd say they're larger than any of our butterfly caterpillars will get. Yeah. So you could use some of that Bacillus thuringiensis, but be very careful because you don't want to be affecting any of the butterfly caterpillars. And one thing you can do if you see Too much munching, you can pull caterpillars off, make them more visible to the birds, definitely, and birds will eat those hornworms.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. Broom snakeweed is wonderful with a great spring and fall bloom. They just form these nice little mounds of verdant green stems and leaves. And all across the top, you'll have these beautiful golden kind of star-shaped flowers born in clusters. The shrubby lantanas. Now this is just our basic lantana, the Lantana camera. It has this kind of, I call it carnival color. You've got this variety of color with the buds and then the flowers opening. And these can get quite large. They can also spread like crazy. They do develop a lot of fruit when the flowers are pollinated, fruit that birds relish. And so birds will eat fruit and then they'll, go fly or perch somewhere and deposit those seeds from the fruits. So they can be sometimes, some people think of them as a nuisance because they reseed so vigorously, but these are wonderful for butterflies. They bloom all through the warm season. Now there are a lot of cultivars, cultivated varieties and hybrids even of the Lantana camera that most of them stay smaller and most of them are sterile. They bloom, 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 bloom up a storm, but don't produce any fruit. So some people think of these as more desirable. You can plant either because the butterflies will definitely visit them.
And here, one more real quick question. Are all these plants low water use plants that you're presenting?
Definitely. Yes, they are.
Okay,
yes,
cool. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very popular small mounding lantana, the new gold, and it just has these brilliant deep golden flowers in profusion all through the warm season. So it is a hybrid. It is one that won't produce fruits, so it just puts all of its energy and effort into producing more blooms. Lavenders, we have a range of lavenders that offer great nectar for butterflies and hummingbirds. And we have another situation here where different lavenders will have slightly different bloom cycles. So you could have a variety of them to expand that nectar availability. And it's important to know your lavenders because some might only get a foot tall, a foot to 2 feet wide. Others can attain a height of 3 or 4 feet with similar spread. But in general, all of your lavenders have to have a super well draining soil and they need a lot of sun. So these, you have these clusters, this little, kind of an elongated head here with individual tiny little flowers that offer a lot of nectar. Some more, different types of lavenders. I find the French lavender and sweet lavender are amongst the easiest to grow, a little bit more forgiving of drainage than some of the others. But I would suggest, trying any of them. Now, here is one, the fernleaf lavender. You can see its foliage, how it gets that common name. Now this is one, it smells a little different and it tastes a little different. So in spite of that though, it has, if we don't get really cold in the winter, it has the longest bloom cycle of any of the lavenders. They can start blooming in October in the fall and continue, if it doesn't have a freeze, through March or April, sometimes even into May the next spring with these delightful deep purple flowers. So here we have some different, a range of butterflies here. The queens, we've got some, painted lady visiting, and the pipevine swallowtail. You get different butterflies visiting. So long blooming, if we don't have a bed freeze in the winter, that will stop the bloom. This is also the only lavender that could suffer damage with a freeze. Sometimes if we get down to maybe 20 degrees, 19, 20 degrees, they could even die. The other lavenders don't even bat an eye at those temperatures. So here is a hibiscus relative that's kind of cool. This is the widest the flower opens. Hummingbirds really visit this flower, but there are some of our butterflies that have a sufficiently long proboscis that they can also indulge in some of the nectar, such as this cloudless sulfur. The autumn sage, the tubular flowers, they're not very long. If you look at the length of that tube, they're not very long, and you've got a perfect, attachment with the lower lip of these flowers. The butterflies can grab onto that perch and sip the nectar. With the autumn sage, you have a range of colors from reds to pinks and corals to even white blooms. Doesn't matter to the butterflies. Any color will make them happy. It's just the nectar that they're there for. The main bloom period for our autumn sage is in the spring and then again in the fall. If it's got a little bit of shade, and if it's not too wicked hot, you can have bloom, a little lesser bloom through the summer. And if it's in a toasty warm space, you could even have bloom during the winter also. Here is a wonderful sage, the Mexican bush sage, that has interesting pubescent or fuzzy flowers. The flowers might be, this outer portion here is called a calyx. So some of these might have a white petal flower and a purple calyx. Others have purple flowers and purple calyx. So it just depends on the grower. They're the same species, and butterflies are just as happy with either. Here in the valley, it seems like your main bloom, the nectar offering, will be in the fall. If we have a really mild winter, you might have some spring bloom, but most commonly, the plants kind of take a little rest during the winter. We get cold enough that they're not very vigorous through the winter, so oftentimes they don't have sufficient growth to bloom in the spring, but definitely September, October, November, you can enjoy these beautiful blossoms on the Mexican bush sage.
Excuse me, Kirti.
Yes.
Can any of these, one of the questions are, can any of these plants be grown in pots?
Yes, I'd say most of them. The important thing to remember is have large containers. At minimum, I would suggest a 2-foot wide container. The larger, the better to get these plants through the heat of the summer. Now, with a larger container, you have a larger mass of soil that can hold the soil for a longer period of time, hold the moisture for a longer period of time. And it also doesn't get as hot as in a smaller container. So overall, it's best to have big containers. You can, especially if it's not a plant that will get huge at maturity, you can even make it into a little container landscape, planting several things. Don't be afraid of, oh, I just want this plant and it's so big. You can plant several smaller plants in a large container.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. So here we have the fritillary visiting the Mexican bush sage, and they are just delightful, gorgeous butterflies, and sulfurs also, a little bit more muted in color. And our goldeneye is another one with a long bloom season, peak bloom in the spring and fall, but they still continue, to have some bloom during the summer months. These daisy-like flowers, perfect landing pad, offering a good amount of nectar. And these checkered whites, they use this. The adults will visit for nectar, but also it's a larval food plant, so they will lay eggs as well, and you'll have these colorful caterpillars feed on the vegetation mainly. Now some perennials, the butterfly mist, ageratum. These have beautiful, delicate, kind of pale lavender pink flowers that are most abundant in the spring to early summer. And our desert marigold blooms practically year-round. I'd say at most it takes a brief rest in the middle of winter, but they're just so drought tolerant, sun worshiping, and they attract the skippers. Beautiful blooms. Chocolate flower is another one that can attract different species of butterflies. They bloom from the spring right on through, usually even through November, with these delightfully sweet chocolate scented flowers. Now, the mist flower, these flowers look so similar to the ageratum, but the foliage is very, very different, and they have a slightly different bloom cycle. The mist flower will usually start blooming, really getting into it kind of early to midsummer, and then bloom on into the fall. So their blooms kind of spread out a nice amount of nectar time if you want to have both of these in your garden. So there's one of my favorite skippers. And in the fall, oh my gosh, queens especially will be all over this mist flower. It's just almost magical. If you have a patch of this, and this can, if it has moisture, not just right at the central base, but a little bit outside of that, they can spread by underground runners. And if you get a nice patch of these going in the fall, you will have so many butterflies, especially so many of the queens visiting. The Arizona foldwing or Dicliptera, it's a wonderful native that can grow in full sun to light or even moderate shade and have these lovely blooms. They don't get profuse blooms, but they'll bloom throughout the year in cycles. The little pea-like flowers are just so delicate looking. They're wonderful. The petals splay open enough that a butterfly can land and sip nectar from these flowers. The fleabane, oh my gosh, they are so profuse in blooms in the spring. You'll have numerous smaller butterflies visit these. Their flowers are yellow centered with just beautiful, delicate looking, pale pink to white petals surrounding that inner disc. And they will bloom, they'll bloom usually from mid-spring right on through the entire summer to fall. Now we have gaillardias that are annuals and perennials. So here is our perennial blooming. They're very similar in looks, just slightly different bloom cycles. So you could plant both of these to have an extended bloom for your butterflies. And the flowers are just gorgeous, deep colors of gold and kind of maroon. And there are some that are, cultivars, cultivated varieties that might have even slightly different color, maybe more maroon or maybe all golden. This is a must-have for your butterfly garden. The native verbena has an incredible bloom in the spring And even it'll trickle through blooming in the summer if you do give it a good watering, maybe every 1 to 2 weeks. But it is very drought tolerant, especially compared to the non-native verbenas. And those flowers are so sweetly scented. The petunias kind of smell like our native verbena, and you'll have different types of butterflies visit these, and some of them even use it as a larval food plant. Now, this is a cool season blooming, beautiful red flowered red justicia. The plants do not fare well in full sun here in the valley, so I do recommend during the summer months that they get some midday or afternoon shade to protect them. And Blackfoot daisies, this is another one, sweetly scented flowers that blooms almost year round. They're just so delightful, and you'll just have butterflies gracing them through most of the year. Very, very drought tolerant. They will not tolerate poorly draining soil. They'll just rot. And primarily spring blooming cone flowers. You might have those with these big ray flowers that are all yellow or bicolored, or even totally this kind of maroon or burnt orange color. So, all the same, and the butterflies will be attracted to any of these, and they will land, and these are individual little flowers in clusters on this cone structure that they will derive the nectar from. And here is an aster that is just fabulous. It has the most delicate pale pink flowers. In the fall, the range of butterflies that will visit these plants is wonderful. Now, I do just want to mention some of these plants, they're a little lesser known. You might need to hit some of the plant sales at our botanical institutions. Here in the valley, the Desert Botanical Garden, Boyce Thompson Arboretum. Take a little drive out towards Superior, and even the botanical institutions down in Tucson also. So a lot of these gardens, they grow things themselves that you really wouldn't find at just a general nursery. But otherwise, I recommend looking to our local nurseries more so than the box stores, because they really do feature more of the appropriate desert adapted plants for us in our gardens. Here is a great fall bloomer. September, October, November, these brilliant golden yellow small marigolds will top this wonderful plant that's very aromatic and tasty. Smells kind of like licorice. And the flowers, you'll get skippers, my favorite, and other butterflies visiting these as well. Just don't be surprised. This flower will usually die back to the ground during the winter and resprout around mid or late March. So beautiful, beautiful. And here is the Mexican bush sage with the Mexican mint marigold and a skipper visiting that nice butterfly garden. Angelita daisy. Now, our desert marigold can be super finicky about drainage. If that is a problem in your landscape, or if you want to grow it in a container, go with this Angelita daisy. They are more forgiving and flexible about soil moisture. I don't recommend, that's probably the only one on the list so far that I would not recommend you try growing in a container is the desert marigold. The flowers are very similar to each other. Just very great difference in the foliage, though. Both of them bloom practically year-round to provide nectar. And here's one, the golden fleece. It just blooms, 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 blooms all through the warm season with tiny little daisy-like flowers. This is great. You'll have skippers and blues and a nice range of butterflies visiting these flowers. And oh, yep, see, there's a blue. They're so small, you really have to be, pausing to notice them in the garden. And our native desert zinnia is another great one for our butterflies. So a few annuals, brilliant coreopsis or tick seed is great. Spring bloomer, You can plant seed or plants in the fall. And so this is our annual blanket flower. I showed you the perennial one before. And our summer poppy, we don't have too many, but we do have some annual wildflowers that will bloom during the warm season. And this is just can be a star in the garden, and it really accommodates butterflies and even a lot of our native little bees. The monardas, this is an annual, but perennials as well are wonderful for providing nectar from these fairly short and very open tubular flowers. So this is a great time now towards the end of October or even through November. Get your seed of your wildflowers out, your spring blooming wildflowers. And some ground covers. Now I talked about the shrubby dahlias. This is a ground cover, very low growing, super drought tolerant, and the flowers are almost identical to those of the black dahlia. Wonderful, fabulous bloom in the spring, and usually a good bloom again in the fall. And if you've got it in a nice sunny area, most often you've got at least a few of these little flower clusters at any time of the year. We talked about the shrubby lantanas, also the lantana camara. This is low growing, trailing the lantana montevidensis. If you've got them out in a nice sunny spot, they usually don't even get more than a foot in height. We do have this kind of pinkish lavender bloom, as well as white and yellow blooming forms. So any of these are great all through the warm season. These are going to give you fabulous bloom. And the trailing lantana is a little bit more cold hardy than the shrub forms, if that's an issue for you. Okay, so those are the plants that offered loads of nectar for the adults. Some of them also are larval food, but now I'm going to talk about the just a few great plants to accommodate the feeding of those caterpillars. So remember, these are plants that some of it's going to disappear, but generally they grow back. This wonderful native hackberry, the flowers are teeny tiny. You generally don't even notice when they're in bloom, but they do produce these beautiful pea-sized fruits. The main thing for our butterflies is it's a larval food plant for some of our natives. So these kind of irregular form leaves that are very often on this zigzagging branch form are going to be a source of food for some of our native butterflies. And oh my gosh, one of my favorites. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I forgot to give you the 7 o'clock reminder, but it's 7:06.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. The Indian mallow has velvety, soft, heart-shaped leaves. Very adorable. This is a great one. You really don't have the adults visit the flowers for any nectar. This is a great one, though, for our native little tiny native solitary bees, the flowers. But the Indian mallow or superstition mallow is a larval food plant for our Arizona powdered skipper. So this is a skipper that lays its eggs, and then the caterpillars just get nice and plump until they pupate and complete their life cycle, metamorphosizing into the next adult. We have to have milkweeds for queens and monarchs. Our desert milkweed is so drought tolerant, so sun worshiping. Do not put this plant in any shade. It has to be out in all day exposed sun to give you these fabulous forms of these upright, numerous, almost leafless stems. It's very sculptural in its form. The flowers are funky, just like any of our milkweeds. Very unusual form. But the flowers, they provide nectar for the queens and the monarchs. And also, it is a larval food plant. We have a new growth, the very tips of the stems with new growth. You have these slender, almost thread-like leaves that develop. They will drop as soon as the soil dries out. So they're not present for very long. If caterpillars eat them, no big deal. They're not going to be there for much time anyway. Caterpillars might also munch on flower buds or flowers. Who cares? These bloom all summer long. And they might eat on very young developing seed pods while they're still kind of soft and green. But all these plant parts can easily regrow. It's rare that maybe a desperate caterpillar eats actually the stem portion, but usually it's these more tender parts. And the chrysalis might develop on the plant, or either of these might crawl away. So these, the monarchs, they can really get pretty plump. And you can tell them because they're only black and white and yellow, and they have 2 pairs of these little protrusions. The queens have, in addition to the black and white and yellow, have a little bit of red, and they have 3 pairs of these protrusions. I don't know, I can never remember what those are called. They look like antennae, but that's how you tell the difference between the queen and the monarch. 3 pairs, a little bit of red, and with the monarch, just 2 pairs, no red. Just a nice butterfly garden. You have milkweed, a fairy duster, some of our native verbena. It looks like some desert marigold, all kinds of wonderful bloom. Now, this is in March, it's in the spring, but there are plants that are going to be providing nectar or leaves during all year round. The white bush morning glory is another nice larval food plant. These caterpillars will eat foliage and even young flower buds or flower petals. This is another one of those shrubby dahlias, and very similar color to the Dahlia frutescens that we saw. This one gets a little bit larger, the pulchra, a little bit larger than the black dahlia, and its bloom is a little bit more winter into spring. We have brittle bush that some people think of as a weed. It is fabulous for checkered whites. For their the adults will get nectar, but also they'll lay eggs, and their little larvae will start chomping away at leaves. Tuberoses also can be suitable for some as a food source for some of our native butterflies, and we have most often found the red form, but there's, sorry about that. There's also a yellow blooming form of the tuberosa available. Both are wonderful for the butterflies and hummingbirds, definitely. And the desert ruellia is a nice one. It has these lovely flowers. It might be visited a little bit by adults, but mainly it's a larval food source. And some perennials. This is a milkweed native down in southern Arizona towards Tucson. Here you have to give it a little midday and afternoon shade in the summer. This is unlike our desert milkweed that you have to put in the sun. This one you can't put out in full sun in the middle of summer. But it maintains these leaves year round, which is a little different also, a little bit more tropical looking almost. And the flowers are smaller, kind of this white or pale pink color. Great for both the queen and the monarchs. Grasses. Many of our Southwest native perennial grasses are wonderful as a larval food source. There are some just wonderful forms out there that give us visually some interesting blooms, especially in the fall season. And these are so cool. They look like little eyelashes or something. And some of these, such as this blue grandma, you can even make a very low maintenance lawn out of it. Now, this isn't one that you'd want to walk on barefoot, but low maintenance, mow it just a couple times a year, and it gives you the effect of turf, but not all that maintenance and water use. And here we have some sun drops. Okay, I totally spaced out. This is a larval food plant for our native sphinx moths, the white-lined sphinx moth, but that's okay, right? We can have one for the moths in here. The penstemons, most penstemons bloom in the spring, but this rock penstemon is a summer bloomer. So for months, it loves to be out in the beating sun, providing these beautiful red flowers. So they do have that configuration that will allow for the butterflies to land. Long blooming is the firecracker penstemon, usually at least February till May. And as I say, a great larval food source, but sometimes you'll have butterflies visiting the flowers. They're not the most frequent in flower, but these can be good larval food plants. And the sweet scented spring blooming, Palmer penstemon, and I think everybody knows our brilliant spring blooming Perry's penstemon. So larval food source, all of these great penstemons, as well as the canyon penstemon. Oops. So the perennial ruellia, or some people call it Mexican petunia, because if you look, the floral shape is a little bit similar to a petunia. This is another larval food source, like the shrub form as well. And oh my gosh, our little native desert senna. This is a must-have. It blooms all through the summer. The plants are short-lived, but long bloom all through the summer. The flowers are open for you in the morning. Flowers aren't a concern for the butterflies, but it's a larval food plant. And especially the cloudless sulfurs. Oh my gosh, these caterpillars are gorgeous. If they are eating more of the flowers, they have more of a yellow color. If they're focusing more on foliage, they'll have a little bit of a greenish yellow color. But they are just the coolest. Well, amongst the coolest of the caterpillars. And we have sunflowers. Now, this is a cultivated form, but especially our native wild sunflower. It doesn't produce very large flowers, but it's a great one because you have so much foliage, and these get quite large within just one season. But they're wonderful. If you get these bordered patch laying their eggs on this, they're almost scary gorgeous, very brilliantly colored. So the birds, I suspect, because of that color, stay away from these. They're real spiky looking, but here you can see the adult border patch. And lupins, our spring blooming lupins, both our low desert, desert lupin, and the slightly higher elevation arroyo lupin. We can still grow this one. It takes a little bit more water than the desert, but still not a water hog. So these, we need to be planting our seed pretty soon, and we'll have these wonderful spring blooms. And the crownbeard is fabulous. These bloom all through the summer, spring on through the summer months. And a few vines, the pipe vine, you have to have some of these. This is our native one. They have the coolest flowers. In sun, they have more of a maroon color leaf, and in the shade, more of a bright, brighter green. But they support these really awesome pipe vine swallowtails. The eggs are bright orange globes. Here's a hatchling, first instar, and then they get larger and larger. They look like they have little, clown hats or something on, but they are just magnificent. And here it is starting to pupate. Now these make a sling out of this kind of silken thread. And you'll notice them, they're kind of hanging like a J at first, and then they make this sling. So they're connected at the end with that silk-like material, and then they make a sling for themselves. And the swallowtails just for defense, have this interesting feature where if they feel threatened, they'll pop out these horn-like little orange feature, the osmeterium, that give off kind of an odd scent. But this is the chrysalis, so very different from a queen or a monarch. It looks like a dried up leaf, and some of them, they'll be different colors, even individuals. So very, very interesting. And the passion vines are larval food source for our swallowtail, the Gulf not swallowtail, I'm sorry, the Gulf fritillary. And they are gorgeous, kind of orange on the outside, upper wing surface, and below it looks like somebody painted these wings with silver, very delicate designs. The eggs, they'll usually not lay in clusters, but individuals here and there on upper or lower leaf surface. And once the egg hatches, the young will start eating. They'll eat molt. And here we see the molting process. This one, he's almost finished climbing out of his old exoskeleton, climbing out of his skin. You can see it left behind here. And they even pop off their head. Sorry, I lost my head. To me, it's just amusing. And when we take time in our gardens to observe these life cycles, it is just thrilling. So here he's kind of like, I think, saying a little prayer that he doesn't get eaten before his exoskeleton dries. But there's the old head. And here, so they'll slightly change in color. And this one, it's getting into that J position to pupate, attached here. And this is what their chrysalis looks like. So very different. So we have a range of passion vines that are great for them. This is native in southern Arizona, the Mexican passion vine, and it has very small flowers. Some people say they smell like mothballs. I think they smell kind of cool. Anyway, but here you can see they've one pupated there on the branch of a tree. So you can find a lot more information. Some of you might be familiar with this booklet, Landscape Plants for the Arizona Desert. If you go online and you have this website on your handout, the very last page, AMWA, Arizona Municipal Water Users Association website, they have this booklet online, and you have so many more examples, photographs of the plants that are just so alluring. You can also use a search feature there to kind of weed out plants or narrow down the plants that are what you're interested in. So I really encourage you to use their website. It's a great tool, and a good many of the plants that I whizzed through this evening are found on that website, and others you can find information on some of those other resources. But thank you so much for joining us. And your head's probably spinning, but I just really wanted you to see what range of desert adapted plants we have available that can be utilized to create the most magnificent butterfly oasis here in our Sonoran Desert. So thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Kirti. We do have a question here. How far do you recommend placing a butterfly garden near a vegetable garden?
They can be, adjacent. You just want to be careful, make sure that you're not using any chemicals that would harm any of, butterfly adults or caterpillars. But I would think if it's your vegetable garden, you're probably going to be limiting the use of chemicals anyway.
Perfect. We got a lot of kudos. Wonderful, enjoyed this and your class at the MG2. Thank you, Kirti, very informative. This was wonderful, thank you. Someone said, could you mention the website again?
Oh, yes. It's the website of Arizona Municipal Water Users Association. So it's amwua.org. And that is listed on the last page of your text handout.
Thank you.
I don't know if you could even notice I have butterfly earrings on tonight. Yes, I'm goofy. Any other questions?
Someone said they didn't see it on the handout.
It should be on the last page with the website listings.
Should be, let's see. I'm pretty sure I remember seeing it there too. It should be, so it's not in like it's not in the presentation handout. It should be on the other.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
I forgot to put it on that slide. It's on the text handout.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, amwua.org. So, and get out, we have some wonderful demonstration gardens around the valley, and get out and see some of these plants. It can be really fun, and you can get an idea of the plants live by going to visit some of those gardens.
And then I responded to the question, so it's the amwua.org, and then you can actually do /plants. It will take you right to the plants page. But thank you, Kirti. I don't see any other questions here. Let me just double check again. Let's see. I don't see any other questions. So thank you, Kirti. I appreciate another awesome presentation for our last workshop of the season. And just want to thank everyone for attending. Here you'll see the city and town websites. You can always access that for additional information, resources, or to contact us. When you close out of the event tonight of the WebEx, you'll receive a short survey about tonight's class. Both Chandler and Clean Creek would really appreciate it if you would just take a minute to complete it so that we can use it to improve our classes in the future. But just want to thank everyone again in Kirti and hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you, and I hope you're all enjoying butterflies in your gardens. Bye.